all of you who dialed in today. Before I begin, I'd like to ask everyone to try to rename yourself and maybe put your organization beside your name so we can all know who is with us today and maybe help create some connections somewhere down the line. On behalf of the World Benchmarking Alliance, I warmly welcome all of you to the launch webinar for the 2021 Digital Inclusion Benchmark Insights Report. The report is now online and the links will be shared with all of you in the chat. So if it isn't already, it will be there very soon. We will touch on some of the analyses presented in this 102-page report in our discussion today. But I encourage all of you to explore the report with its rich analyses of the patterns and trends across the digital inclusion benchmark indicators for 150 of the world's most influential technology companies. So the report has detailed data and insights, which we invite you to share and reference, and also use in your own work and engagement. So feel free. It's a public good and we share that freely and publicly. We will begin with a presentation by WBA's digital benchmark team, followed by a discussion with our panel of experts. And this session will be recorded and shared online, and we encourage all of you to also share it through your social media channels. We also encourage each and everyone to share your comments and ask questions in the chat, and we will do our best to answer and respond. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleagues, Nicolas Sui, our Stakeholder Engagement Manager, Michael Minguez, our Research Lead, and our Research Analysts, Samantha Indiwalana and Samita Tapa. Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. May I have slide 2, please? Now, this is a visual of WBA's benchmarking journey to creating a better world together with stakeholders, including investors, governments, civil society, individuals, and the private sector. Our work revolves around 7 system transformations, which you can see in the multicolored bigger circle on this slide. We believe that these transformations need to take place to put the society and the worldwide economy on a more sustainable path to achieve the UN SDGs. In close collaboration with over 300 global allies, WBA develops a series of benchmarks which assess 2,000 of the world's most influential companies, which we call the SDG 2000. So we rank these companies and measure them on their contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the digital inclusion benchmark is one of the 7 system transformation. And last year, our second iteration of the results assessed 150 of the world's most influential tech companies on their contribution towards achieving digital inclusion. And by 2023, we shall have benchmarked a total of 200 leading technology companies. As you can see on the visual, our benchmark data empower our allies and other stakeholders to take action on the critical issues such as the ones that will be discussed in this webinar later on, in order to create a better world for everyone. And now I'll hand over to my colleague, Michael Minguez, who is the research lead for the Digital Inclusion Benchmark, to share more about the key findings of this report. Michael?
Thank you, Nicholas. The benchmark is based on a 4-pronged system that's interlinked, and we find that digital inclusion, it starts with access, that people need to have access to digital technologies in order to benefit. But many people in the world, particularly poor, women and girls, elderly, people with disabilities, still lack that access. Once you have access, you need skills in order to use digital technologies in a meaningful way. And that in turn turns to use, where it needs to be safe, trustworthy and safe to encourage people to use it. And finally, digital, it's a history of innovation, but that innovation needs to be inclusive, open, and ethical in order for it to be sustainable. Next slide, please. So as was said, we benchmark 150 digital companies. They come from various sub-industries within the digital world. We've narrowed them down to three broad areas: hardware companies, telecom services, IT services, and software. We like to say these companies range from Acer to ZTE. They include all the largest PC manufacturers, the largest smartphone manufacturers, all the leading network equipment, hardware companies, telecom operators that cover 90% of all the mobile subscriptions in the world, as well as all the leading cloud and data center companies. They also include regional champions, such as the largest ride-hailing company from Indonesia, the largest e-commerce company in Latin America, as well as companies that are big in their own national markets, such as Spark in New Zealand or Safaricom in Kenya. So very wide scope, but also including some of the as I said, regional and national companies to have a wide perspective on this. Next slide, please. So these are the headquarters of the 150 companies. The red circles are the 50 new companies. They're present in almost, they're headquartered in almost 50 different countries around the world, but their reach through their operations is over 175 countries. Next slide, please. So I'm very happy to present the Insights report, which we're launching today. This is what we say is the facts and figures behind the benchmark, behind those numbers that came out in December. It provides all kinds of deeper analysis, puts the indicators into context, provides examples of best practice, and features lots of tables with 4 chapters, an overview of some of the key findings. The second chapter is the key digital inclusion topics that we identified. And then the third chapter is something new about the social transformation. We'll discuss that later. And the fourth chapter is a set of tables that shows a lot of the digital inclusion information by company. So you can see, like, you know, how this company is doing and how it compares to other companies. So one of the first findings was that only about 24 companies really have achieved some level of digital inclusion, meaning a score of at least 50 out of 100. So clearly the efforts need to be accelerated. And the report, it's profuse with examples of what is best practice that other companies can then see and emulate, hopefully. Now I'd like to turn to my colleague Samantha to present some of the other key findings.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, perfect. So our second key finding is that while companies are enthusiastic about AI and the benefits, they're often failing to consider the risks. And we saw that just 20 out of the 150 companies had publicly available ethical AI principles. And the consequences of this mean that this could lead to situations where AI is used in a way that might be harmful, such as when AI is biased against a certain race or gender. It could lead to job losses or a loss of agency. Next slide. And in this slide, we give a taste of some of the data, the richness of the information that can be found in the report. In this slide, you see that not only did we look at ethical AI principles, we dive deeper to look at whether those principles are aligned with regional or national standards. And here we're showing which companies had an AI oversight group or committee which oversees how AI is operationalized within that organization. And with regards to this, we note that leading companies go further in their practices. They don't just have principles or committees, they're transparent about how they apply ethics in practice. Next slide, please. Our next finding notes that while companies have lots of tech for good initiatives and we could find lots of information about these initiatives, there was limited information about the impact of these initiatives. And that's because few companies, only 12 we found, conducted third-party impact assessment on these initiatives, whether it's for access to digital technologies or digital skills. Impact assessments are particularly important because we need to know, and the companies themselves also need to know, the impact of these programs. Are they benefiting the people they had planned to benefit? Is the impact positive on this group? This information is important to know so that companies can organize their practices and so the public has an understanding of what companies are doing with these tech for good initiatives. Next slide. And here again, in this table, you can see the companies which conducted impact assessments for which area. Was it a digital skills program? Was it an access program? And you're even able to access these impact assessments so that you can have a look at the impact of these programs yourself. I now hand over to my colleague, Samantha.
Thank you, Samantha. So one of our key findings this year, again, was that we need more women in tech. So in our research of the 150 digital companies, we looked at the number of women who are engaged in technical roles, as we believe it's an important indicator for the inclusion and diversity in the industry, not just simply looking at the number of women employees in a digital company. But we realized that there's actually a lack of standard definition on what it means to be women in tech. So the technical roles that are defined in companies seem to vary quite a bit, and this makes this comparison challenging. And in our Insights report, you will actually see in one of the tables, we list out the different definitions that the companies have been using to define this role. So you can dive deeper. And of the total companies that we had reviewed, just 1/3 of the companies actually do report the number of women in technical roles. And unfortunately, out of that, the average number of females in technical roles still is a low and disappointing number at 23%. And we also asked companies whether they disclose their R&D staff and whether they disclose the number of women in their R&D teams. While 25 companies reported the total number of R&D staff, only 7 of these companies actually reported the number of women in these teams. And since gender diversity is also important beyond technical roles and in the company's highest governance body, which is typically the board of directors, we found that it was quite encouraging to see that 147 out of the 150, so the majority of the companies did disclose this number. However, only 54 of them had more than 30% women representation in the board. And when we were looking at trends, it was interesting to see that we were looking at the trends according to industry and according to geography, and hardware companies continue to lead in the disclosure when it comes to reporting the number of women in technical roles. And in terms of geography, the United States continues to lead in this disclosure as well. It was, however, encouraging this year to see that 18% more companies disclose this information in comparison to last year, and that most of this increase comes from companies that are headquartered in the Republic of Korea and Japan. And I now hand it over back to Michael Mingus.
Thank you. Yeah, I forgot to mention, behind me is the cover of the report. We just wanted to point out the significance. As you can see, it's a young boy on a video conference, and illustrating the impact that COVID has had around the world, and how digital technologies have stepped up to enable people to continue working or continue learning. Although there's still huge gaps. Many people cannot take advantage of this because they lack the tools or the skills to do so. And that's a second point about the cover, is that we did find that there were quite a few digital companies that had special initiatives for COVID, such as making access to educational sites free, providing laptops to poor households so that the children can learn online. And all of this is documented in the report. So now I'll turn to the fifth key finding. And one of the new things about the report is that we include the findings of the core social transformation. And one of the findings is that only 15 companies out of 150 had basic human rights processes in place. And that's quite chilling because digital companies introduce all kinds of new risk into human rights. And, you know, as the Human Rights Council, the UN says, the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online. So I think, you know, that's why this is really relevant for digital companies, and progress needs to be made here. Next slide, please. So the core social indicators are go to the heart of what the WBA is about. They cover 3 areas: human rights, ethical behavior, and promoting and providing decent work. And 1,000 of the 2,000 companies in our list have been assessed, including all 150 digital companies. Next slide, please. And, you know, as I mentioned, digital really brings some different aspects into social transformation because of the context of digital companies. For example, there's human rights risks from online content. We see that all the time. There's work implications of platform companies who consider their drivers to be contractors rather than their own employees. There's ethical implications of personal data practices and AI, human rights implications related to child online safety. In terms of ethical practices, there's tax avoidance from operating virtually. And as well, some of the tech companies have really significant lobbying influence that are affecting the kinds of laws and regulations that the public lives with. So, you know, there's really, you know, a whole new angle when you consider digital companies in terms of social transformation. Next slide, please. So if you look at the results shown here, the digital companies actually do slightly better than all 1,000 companies across other industries. Their total score is 6.2 compared to 5.2 for the overall average. Hardware companies do best among the digital companies, and companies from Europe do the best among the different regions. Next slide, please. And if we look at the top 16 companies in digital transformation, it's an interesting mix. One of the things that popped out at me was that 4 Korean companies were in the top 16. So that's 4 out of the 5 or 6 that we benchmark. And hardware companies tend to do really well in the social transformation. And in fact, I think almost all of the hardware companies but one do much better in core social transformation than they're doing in digital inclusion. And I'd just like to point out Microsoft, they're at 7th, has the highest score in human rights. And we're very honored that we have one of the human rights experts on as a discussant today that can explain how they do so well. Next slide, please. So here are all the downloads for the insights report, the results of that came out in December, spreadsheets with all the data for both the core social and digital inclusion, and for those that want to engage on social media, some of the tags to use. Next slide, please. And finally, none of this would be possible without our funders shown here. And I just want to give a shout out to the government of Canada that's very supportive of our digital inclusion activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So everyone can see that that's just a taste, you know, just a taster of the depth and the richness of the data and the insights that you can find in the Digital Inclusion Benchmark 2021 Insights Report. So the link is there. Please download, explore, extract facts and figures, and feel free to use it in your work advocacies and engagements. we are very honored to have with us a panel, a very distinguished panel of experts to reflect on their takeaways from the insights report from their own perspectives and their own work. So I start with Christine Chow, who is head of stewardship at HSBC Asset Management. Christine, thank you for being with us today. Looking at the DIB Insights report, what issues do you stand out that investors should be concerned about and address?
Well, thank you very much, the World Benchmarking Alliance, for inviting me. I'm actually having COVID, so my voice is a bit weird, but I don't really want to miss this fantastic event. So I guess investors' concern about digital rights started out, I would say, as far as I remember, from something much more basic, and in some ways prompted by the introduction of the GDPR back in 2015. But I guess with more and more engagement, we understand that the landscape is shifting very quickly, and the human rights impact angle, the social angle of that, not only data privacy, but in general, the impact of technology has prompted much wider discussion. So I just want to make 3 points here and connect your report findings to sort of the investor's view. So the first point I want to make is that traditionally, companies or investors in general consider material issues. So for example, materiality assessment is one of the most common content you can find in companies' sustainability report. And they often refer to what is material to a company, for example, financial materiality. And what the UN Guiding Principles, Business and Human Rights, however, focuses on what is salient. So what is important to those who are affected. And I must say that a lot of investors are still not really understanding, even after 10 years of UNGP having been published, many investors are still getting a little bit confused by what is material and what is salient and how we address that. So I think this report has given us a really good tool again to emphasize that what is material could be salient as well, and we can look at that through different angles. Investors and corporates must recognize that both of them are important and both need to be addressed. And more recently, the introduction of the mandatory human rights due diligence is a milestone that is going to work alongside this report to put human rights impact assessment at the center of business activities, but also in investor engagement through the lens of salience, where in ESG risk management and impact-led initiatives from a sustainable development angle, that's where they meet. The second point I want to make is that digital inclusion and digital rights are material to companies and salient to users, especially in times of crisis. And we are not short of them these days. We are concerned about access to safety, access to food, and undoubtedly they cannot be possible if we have no access to information, access to trusted information, reliable access to that trusted information as well. So in many ways, the modern utility that is vital to our very existence as a society and its functioning lies with the companies that you have researched here, that digital rights. So it's a very important segment that we're looking at. And in protecting human rights and supporting the connection to those who are really in need. The third point related to the report is that I want to go back to AI and technology. Technology has no good or bad. It is a tool. So how we use it determines whether it serves the good of humanity or otherwise. So AI can potentially correct historical bias that we have as humans, provided we are careful in the way we design how it is being used. But at the moment, in general, companies are not doing that. As you have pointed out in the report, there's too much focus on the rosy side of what AI could bring. We believe that too. Investors believe that it brings a lot of opportunities. But in order to make that opportunities sustainable, the business sustainable, we need to have a fair view in understanding how AI systems work and that very long supply chain. Something I've mentioned in the report that I put out back in 2019, that was the first I think it was the industry's first investor expectations report on that. And it's still an issue, not understanding systems properly. And let's support technology for good, encourage diverse participants in technology, including minority and women. So an extremely important report to bring it to life, what is important with some concrete examples. So many congratulations in launching this important report.
Thank you, Christine. And we hope that this report will also be useful in your engagement work with the companies, with its richness of data that we present at a company level. Very happy to have you with us today. And I hope that you get well soon. And next, I'd like to invite Afiq Fitri, one of our expert panels. He represents media. He's a journalist with New Statesman Media Group. And Afiq, what do you think are the issues that that you've taken away from the insights report that need further public awareness or action in general so that digital inclusion can be achieved?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Lourdes, and thanks very much to the WBA for inviting me to this panel. I think there's two parts to this question. So I'm going to first give a few regional observations based on the report and some thoughts on how that might play out in the future, I think. So one of the things that I find really interesting is how Chinese tech companies have consistently performed way below the average in the core social indicators and every measurement area in the benchmark in recent years. And I think there's lots of reasons for this, and I won't have the time to go into that into detail, but what I will say is that I think recent policy developments in China may impact the digital inclusion landscape there soon. And that's primarily because China has recently passed a set of AI governance laws called the Internet Information Service Algorithmic Recommendation Management Provisions, which is quite a mouthful when you translate that into English. And this legislation does a whole bunch of things, right? So for example, the law in China now makes it compulsory for tech companies to implement systems for trustworthy and explainable algorithms. It also forces companies that use AI recommendation services to carry out ethics reviews. And there's also a prohibition on algorithmic discrimination and the promotion of addictive content. And I think this law also provides very strict protections for the entire gig economy in China. And there have been recent reports that Chinese tech companies are starting to take this very, very seriously. And I think this is quite significant as the set of laws is essentially quite similar to the EU's AI regulation draft in most aspects, because I mean, mainly within the field of trying to create a more human-centric and trustworthy environment for the use of artificial intelligence. And I think that the main difference is that China has already implemented these laws, while the EU will probably face opposition from big tech's lobbying army for quite some time before it turns into legislation. So I think such national policies might potentially change the landscape for ESG reporting and digital inclusion in China. But the main challenge still lies in getting access to the relevant data from Chinese tech companies, and in trying to encourage a culture of open data reporting on certain ESG metrics, which can be argued is not as established compared to Western tech companies, really. Although I think it has to be said that the trend of ESG reporting in China has been increasing in recent years. And the number of Chinese institutions, for example, signing up to the UN principles on responsible investment has also increased. So I think it's going in the right general direction in China. So I think this is a really important space to watch, as we know that Chinese tech companies, they have a massive footprint across the globe, right? And international norms on AI governance can and will proliferate to other parts of the world. So it's definitely something that we'll be monitoring over the next few months. And I think it's something that other media organizations should be looking at as well. As for the second part of the question, for the kinds of issues in the DIB report that need action, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, right? So, but one in particular that really stands out to me is the kinds of impact assessments for various social initiatives, or the lack of it, because the data clearly shows that only a tiny fraction of tech companies have actually published those impact assessments, right? And sorry, and I think that's really important, not just for accountability purposes and a very real risk of impact washing, but I really do think that big tech companies should be leading the way here to set a best practice example, for for other smaller companies. And as the data stands, it's very clear that not enough is being done in that regard. And I'm actually very interested to know the kinds of barriers and roadblocks that some companies may face in publishing impact assessments, because it's not immediately clear to me as to why that's the case. And yeah, thanks. That's what I have to say.
That's a very interesting reflection from you, Afik. Indeed, we've had already some conversations with the Chinese tech companies, and the agenda on common prosperity have really helped them get their act together and start focusing on the importance of digital inclusion. So I think we have a lot of exciting things to watch for in the next iteration of the digital inclusion benchmark, which, by the way, is coming out in the first quarter of 2023. So I hope everyone watches out for that and we can see the changes, but very interesting reflections. And with that, I move on to Ida McDonald. Ida is the team lead for OECD's Development Cooperation Report. They recently released a wonderful report focusing on digital development. And so I asked Ida, we know that the private sector has a crucial role towards fostering an inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation. However, what are the opportunities you see for policymakers and the development cooperation community to close the gaps highlighted in the Insights report? Ida?
Thank you very much, Lourdes, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for inviting us to participate today and also have this opportunity to really make those connections between your analysis, data, and report, which also you contributed to our report. So thank you very much. And this report that we came out with last December called Shaping a Just Digital Transformation. Let me just say from the outset that the OECD is a vast organization. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I sit in the part of the House that is responsible for development cooperation. So that's investments in the developing countries, really focused on SDG delivery, etc. I'm not coming from the digital economy policy side of the House or responsible business conduct, etc. But I should really flag that there is a massive amount of work going on in the OECD around digital transformation, and invite you all to look at that closely. But I'll stick to my mandate of development today. Let me first say that I'm really delighted and was really enjoyed reading the Insights report, and welcome the kind of data evidence-based approach, the benchmarking, and that you are doing, because there is a lack of it, and raising some of those questions around impact. So we need this, we need it to inform our strategies, but also to put that pressure on and increase accountability around the commitments that are made and the statements that are being made. Our report, let me just say, kind of really tried to emphasize some of those strategic decisions that the global community needs to make to support a just digital transformation. And it clearly in there, the private sector comes out thoroughly as one of the largest investors and actors in digital transformation across the globe, and therefore have quite a special responsibility to play, and we need to all be talking to each other and in dialogue. For us, a key finding that we really need to emphasize that, and especially to policymakers, that digital transformation is about much more than technology, right? And that we really need to now stay in the technical space, but we need to come into the policy space to look at how we have those holistic approaches and strategies, regulatory environments, and so on, so that we can get the most from digital transformation. And in that space, shared norms, rules for governing digital technologies are needed. The world is much more complex and the issues are cross-border, and now we're in a space where we're seeing really stepped up action and interest and momentum around those shared norms. Three areas emerge for us, and they really resonate with your report. Upholding human rights and democratic values require global cooperation together, and some solutions and shared norms and standards. Protecting data, strengthening cybersecurity, and limiting disinformation. And of course, tackling inequalities and making digital work for women and girls. So all of these issues are in your report, and there's really great evidence. Let me just point to three areas that struck me in terms of those gaps that you talk about in relation to the private sector. And in that, the challenge around, you talk about voluntary measures of companies and kind of the shortcomings that we see around voluntary measures and the potential for stronger governance. So on inequalities, companies seem to have improved in access measures. And obviously, COVID-19 initiatives really stimulated that and is an area for performance. And there is a movement towards adopting the GSMA principles for digital inclusion for people with disabilities. So that's really positive. It's also very positive to notice that there is some findings and analysis around children online. And in that regard, I just wanted to flag that last May 2021, the OECD actually submitted a recommendation or approved a recommendation on children in the digital environment. And that really helps countries to find a balance between protecting children from online risks and promoting the opportunities of digital transformation. And here is something really to put out on the table into the discussions to what extent a recommendation like this is also speaks to and is a potential for the private sector to be involved. On the increasing digital initiatives for women and girls, which is a finding that you have as well and very interesting, I think it's quite noteworthy that many of these initiatives are with nonprofit organizations. And they also are emphasizing girls in STEM subjects and working with them. This is an area that is a very high priority, I would say, in development cooperation. And there is a really potential here for partnerships, dialogue, knowledge sharing between the private sector and the development cooperation space, but also looking at how you go beyond those standalone initiatives for greater scale and how we get them into actually curriculum and into the policy environment. On human rights and democratic values, I think it's really also very telling and interesting. Well, first of all, positive that you're monitoring around ethical AI. But obviously it's a very, very low count here, and that the voluntary aspect of it is a challenge. As many of you know, the OECD adopted AI principles also in 2019, and that really has more and more countries adhering to it, including the G20 taking on board its AI principles, drawing from the OECD recommendation in AI. And more recently, back in November this year, actually UNESCO adopted a global recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is seeking to promote human rights and human dignity. And it's the first global agreement that exists involving developing countries as well as OECD countries. So I think that this is also really, it's both indicative of how the international community is coming together, has tackling these risks, and obviously how there is scope for the private companies to come in. So let me just now turn to some closing thoughts on development cooperation partnering. The development cooperation side is concessional public finance. It blends it with private finance for impact. And so there are kind of three particular ways that we see a role for development cooperation advancing digital inclusion. One is that really ensuring that policies and partnerships do center on and sharply focus on an inclusive digital future, both at country level, but also at the global level. That the building blocks and the technology itself also supports inclusive digital ecosystems. And here we're really thinking about how you look at digital public infrastructure and the open source dimension, which again, I was struck that you measure and are looking at that. And this is really, I think your report provides useful evidence in that regard. And lastly, how we make financing fit for purpose with greater scale, innovation, and flexibility. And I'd like to close saying a few words about the financing. Because official development finance right now has actually tripled between 2015 and 2019. So we're going to see more and more investments in digitalization to be seen what kind of investments they are. But really, and within that, we saw 4.2 billion in private finance mobilized in that period. So the financing at the moment is concentrated in the communication sector. The multilaterals are looking at the banking and financial services. And so the question here really is how we can pool the resources and understanding that the private sector has a very specific role to play around the infrastructure issues, I think. But how do we incentivize the inclusion aspects of the private sector? And the very last point there, and I think it comes back to the impact question I saw also in the chat function, is that a challenge for everyone, irrespective of whether it's for digital or other development projects, is really how we do not lose sight of the results we want and ensure that we plan, monitor, and evaluate the impacts. The risks around sustainability of initiatives, one-shot initiatives, and not reaching scale, we're not going to make that change in the SDGs that would clearly come out in your report, that actually businesses are seeking to be SDG aligned and to address climate and to really get our emissions down. And in there, I just want to flag that the OECD has a very, very strong evaluation community, very, very dynamic evaluation community, which I think private companies can also tap into in terms of how we evaluate impact, how we monitor impact, and also join our discussions around guidelines for the impact of blended finance, which is also an area. So there's a lot of input type conversations that go on, and we really need to look at the results and the impact. And I really would like to stop there, because I think we are committed, we have a shared commitment to the SDGs. It's a good basis for our dialogue, but we can also really learn from each other. And the OECD is there to facilitate that learning and to help people join forces. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ida. And I think that segues well into our next expert, who is from the private sector himself. And it's really all about how the private and public sector can also contribute. Steve, we have Steve Crown here, who's Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, Human Rights for Microsoft. Thank you for joining us today, Steve. Microsoft is one of the companies that performed well, actually, in the core social indicator results with respect to human rights. Why do you think it's important for technology companies to demonstrate their strong commitment to respecting human rights, and especially with respect to new technologies impacting artificial intelligence, data privacy, and how is Microsoft putting all of this to practice?
Great question. And thank you for inviting me. Really happy to be participating in this, and congratulations on the report. I don't even know how to begin to answer the question why you should. I guess the question would be, of course one must. It's not a choice, should you or should you not. The reality is every company exists in order to attract customers and have people willing to engage in what they're delivering. And in our case, we're trying to deliver solutions that actually enhance the human experience. So our mission, which we take very seriously, is to empower every person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. And by achieve more, we mean do more to enhance the human experience. And as you go through that, if you remove these considerations of human rights, of course, you're going to end up skewing this in a really unfortunate way. Now, it does become complicated for a company to say we're committed to all human rights. There's the Vienna Declaration of 1993 that said all human rights, all of them are universal, they are indivisible, they're interdependent. And then bear in mind, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are both political rights, as it were. So we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but there are also economic, social, and cultural rights. And one of the things that the UN Guiding Principles put out by the UN, that's been referenced before, been out for 10 years, is every company should have a human rights statement. A global human rights statement just says, how are they going to engage these challenges? So I don't want this to be about what, everything that Microsoft does. I would encourage you to go look at the Microsoft Human Rights Statement, look at our annual human rights report we put out each year, and see how we're addressing this. But at the highest level, we take it as this is the future of the company. We're only going to succeed offering digital technologies if people trust what we do as we develop those. And that's not just protecting their data, classic privacy, but how is it being used? And should they want us to be succeeding, and should they be willing to pay us to deliver these services that enhance their life? Because we actually have a book out called Tools and Weapons. And the book is about the fact that it was stated earlier, technology is a tool, but it can also be used as a weapon. And it's been true throughout human history. Fire, it was great. We could keep ourselves warm, we could cook food, but we also developed now the new crime of arson. And every technology we've had, people find a way to misuse it or abuse it or to cause harm. We believe that part of our responsibility in building such powerful solutions as our technologies is to be part of recognizing that and speaking to it. So turning a little bit to the report, I personally, as an executive at Microsoft, I'm not upset if we're not number 1 or number 2. I'd be quite upset if we were way down on the list. But I view all of these reports, and yours is a great report. I encourage people to use it. Really, they are themselves tools. What are the questions you should be asking companies based upon the data that you've been able to compile and present in an accessible way? What's the type of engagement you should have with the companies to make sure they're doing what you would like to see them do? And what are the improvements that collaboratively we can develop? We always know there's a difference between what a company or anyone reports and what they actually do. So just looking at, hey, there's this wonderful statement that a company put out, that's the first stage of engaging with them, of now there's something for you to actually talk to them about. Because there's a big difference between aspirations and actual accomplishments in the real world. And that's what I think the value is. These are, hey, you've made this statement. Let's talk about how that's playing out in a particular place. Let me just say on digital inclusion, which is a big part here, there is no question the critical need, and we're very actively engaged in this. The UN just about a year ago put out a report that almost half of the globe's population does not have internet access. That's 3.7 billion people. Today, it's kind of mind-boggling if you are used to, as I am, working on the internet probably 12 hours a day. There are people who've never actually had access to it or have such sporadic access that they're really not a part of that community. Increasingly, social services as well as cultural experiences are highly correlated with access to the internet. And it's a critical problem we have. So we have a project called Airband where we're deeply engaged in trying to expand literal physical connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia especially, but also in the rural United States where there's this problem. But that's only the first stage of it. Again, this notion of the human right, simply being connected isn't enough. Now, how can they actually use it? And how do you make them empowered users of the internet? And so there's a big part of digital skilling, simply education. There's another report that came out that last year that 85% of the jobs in 2030, so in the next 10 years, 85% of the jobs that people will have do not exist today. It'll be related to this, the growth of Africa, it'll be related and digital opportunities there, but across the globe as people are making this digital transformation. So we really need to be engaged in that. And I think the private sector, those of us in the digital industry, appreciate that we need to be part of the solution, making sure this is going to be an enabling and a desired part of the world. I'll finish really by just noting all of these human rights are interrelated. So most recently, I think it's fantastic, the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council recognized a human right to a clean environment. And so we're massively investing in that too. We have a full $1 billion with a $1 billion investment fund to help spur innovation. We have a commitment to be carbon negative by 2030. That is, we will remove more carbon from the atmosphere every year starting in 2030 than we and our entire supply chain contribute to it. So those are some of the things that are here. I'd say the core explanation to the big question, why participate? We think it's absolutely essential to the business. It's an imperative that we actually see people want to engage and help us design the sorts of solutions that they most need and they're most going to value. But I'll stop there and then look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I hope the report can also be useful to all our benchmark companies, including Microsoft, to draw some, maybe there are best practices, not just from big companies, but also smaller, more regional companies who might have innovative and creative solutions, and everyone can learn from each other. So we hope that's useful in that regard. But I'd like to take this opportunity to give each of our panel of experts a chance to respond to the presentation that has been made, and also to respond to each other with either questions or comments, and let's try to make it sort of interactive. And I can see Afik might have some things on his mind which he might want to share first. So Afik, can we get started with you on your response to what others have said, and maybe a conclusion or a wrap up from your part?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just reiterate my previous points in that I think that policymakers and the state have the strongest methods to pressure the private sector to act. And I'm not sure if you can separate digital inclusion issues from the broader ESG debate that's going on right now in the midst of the ongoing tragedy in Ukraine, which really has shown how the private sector can move very, very quickly when it wants or it needs to, or when it's feeling pressure from the state, investors, and the general public at large. And I think that it really shouldn't take a European war for the private sector at large to make the kinds of ethical decisions that arguably should have been made a long time ago. So I think it's a question of making sure that digital inclusion forms a key plank of any company's ESG strategy, and trying to communicate a certain kind of urgency, and trying to apply the kind of pressure through all of these independent benchmarks. And that's why I think the work of the WBA is really important in that regard. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for now, but I will think of a few questions in a bit.
Thanks, Afik. Ida, would you have any response or concluding remarks based on what everyone has said thus far as a wrap up?
I think really the ESG dimension that's emerging in the conversation, and it's not just new, and how, from an investment perspective, how it really can incentivize the progress around ESG, how it can incentivize integrating digital inclusion across investments, strikes me as something systemic that we will need to do more work on, but it is something that we need to evolve on. And the second question, and I'd love to hear from Steve on this point, is when we think about getting the 3.7 billion online, and we know that there is an infrastructure dimension, although the investments are going there, and rather a competitive environment, I would say, around those infrastructure investments. I mean, Afik might want to speak to that, but if you look on the massive progress that is happening in the African continent in terms of access, how can we get beyond the siloed short-term initiatives, whether it's on upskilling, whether it's getting people online, factoring in the rural urban dimension, etc. If you think about kind of Microsoft in that space, where is it as a leader on all of this, right? We clearly see Microsoft, speaking so much and championing these issues. What is that nexus between the public and private in terms of how we can really join forces and get the scale that we actually need on these issues? I'm really curious. Sorry to put you on the spot, Steve, but it really is a key question for us in our space. Thank you.
And I guess it's obviously addressed to Steve. So Steve, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. Great question. It sounds like you and I probably approach this somewhat similarly, in that there is a pure infrastructure need. People need both the transmission ability, whether it's going to be airwaves or other, but they also need devices and the rest. But again, that is only now saying, okay, you have this machine in front of you, but how do you actually use it to improve your life? And their digital skilling, we view it more broadly. It's not just saying now you're going to be able to code. We think actually you learn the skills to use the digital infrastructure. And so there's a huge soft skill piece to that too, of learning how it can be used. What are the opportunities? And that flows into another dimension of this is, look, the biggest companies, largely on the tech side, they're US-based companies or Chinese-based companies. We are huge champions of multi-stakeholderism. And I refer to it now increasingly as 21st century multi-stakeholderism. It used to be a company would say, okay, we've identified this problem. Here's what we're doing. We put it forward and say, give us your feedback. And then somehow that was a multi-stakeholder engagement and we were there. But what I have in mind of the way it needs to work now, which I think is entirely consistent with everything we've seen happening across the NGO sector, is we actually need to be engaged in conversations at the very state of defining a problem. What is the actual challenge? Not asking a tech company to define what the problem is, but asking, you know, our colleagues in NGOs, asking the affected stakeholders directly, what do they most think they need? And we might disagree as to what would be the right solution, but we need to be engaged in defining the problem. And then most importantly, we need to be engaged in defining the solution. What might make sense to us as a tech company might not be what in fact is most needed. And then we need to be open to this continual dialogue of how do we improve? How do we continue to assess that? And I think all of these benchmarking efforts are related directly to that of how do we get more data, but it's a piece of it. It's not the solution. Thanks.
That's actually worth reflecting on. We have a question or a comment from the chat asking about access to energy as being underpinning and all of these talk about access to digital technologies. So perhaps that's part of the things that need to be a responsibility of both the public and private sector to work together on when we talk about digital inclusion. And we shouldn't forget that energy is still a very important issue for a large part of the world. Anyway, thank you very much to all our panel of experts for sharing your insights and takeaways from the 2021 Digital Inclusion Benchmark Insights Report. We're very happy to have you all here. Thank you to everyone who has dialed in. Please feel free to download the report. It's available online. We have put the links again there. This call will also be, this is also recorded and will be shared online. So feel free to share through your social media channels. The data, the insights are for you to use and reuse and reflect on and use for your engagements and advocacy. So we highly encourage everyone to explore. It's very rich. There's something for everyone, whether you're concerned about child online protection, or you're concerned about privacy, or you're concerned about taxation or access or human rights. It's all there, and you get a lot of in-depth analyses of the trends and patterns across the industry. So please feel free, explore and share the Digital Inclusion Benchmark Insights report. And with that, we conclude, and we thank everyone for being here, and feel free to reach out to us should you need more information as well, and if you wish to collaborate. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day wherever you are. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. Thank you. Bye.